Or how ought I live? And the I is this, universal placeholder. Not for particular individuals, but for like the individual, right? The abstract individual. I haven't introduced this term, but it's a distinction that comes from Rawls, who we've talked about some this semester and you've read about this semester. And this is true in moral philosophy as well as political philosophy. Philosophy is like ideal questions, right? So the main question in Western political philosophy is, what is the ideal form of society, right? And we basically, what is the ideal moral code? Is another way of thinking about what we've been doing, right? So that's the theory that each of these, that's the aim of all these theories, is to come up with the ideal standard, right? And then work out what the implications of that ideal theory are. And then we don't live in the ideal world, so what kinds of stuff do we have to do in order to approximate that ideal, right? And it turns out that lots of people have really noble ideas that have caused people to do really horrible shit all throughout history, right? And so Mills is going to introduce a distinction between ideal theory versus non-ideal theory. And a lot of times, the way we talk in everyday life has built into it these ideals that we don't live up to, obviously, right? Not simply because we fail sometimes, that's not the issue. It's that really our language of the ideal, like a colorblind society, for example, or a gender-neutral or sex-neutral society, masks various power structures in the non-ideal world that prohibit us from realizing those, or even achieving, making progress on those sorts of things sometimes. And so Mills is going to talk about social contract theory, which we've already encountered. And we can think about social contract theory, as an ideal theory or as a non-ideal theory as well, in the sense that, and Kant, the Rawlsian picture is very helpful here. And again, Mills is going to draw on on Rawls, who introduces this distinction. Rawls is an excellent example with that theory of the veil of ignorance, right? That's set up to generate an ideal theory, in fact. We're going to all pretend like and try to reason as if we're behind the veil of ignorance where we don't know what color we are, so we can't come up with gender or race box theories of justice, right? Analogously, you walk into the courtroom, or the courthouse rather, and there's usually a statue in the courthouse. Y'all ever been in court? No, y'all are good law-abiding citizens. I've been in court. I've been in courthouses a bunch, right? You walk into the courthouse, and it's usually a statue of a woman. You know what I mean? Yeah, Lady Justice. What's Lady Justice got on her face? Blindfold. Why is there a blindfold on Lady Justice's face? Because justice is supposed to be colorblind, right? Justice is supposed to be colorblind. And that's the ideal that we like to pretend that we live in. Often case, but really hard to look around and look at some statistics and think that that's happening, for example, right? So keep that distinction here in mind, right? So some beliefs about race that are morally loaded. We did this with gender last time, right? With different things. My parents did this to me. I don't think my parents are horrible people. They're not right about much, but they're not horrible people, and they raised my sister with certain expectations about how she was supposed to behave that were different than the ones that they put on me to behave, for sure, right? Especially when it came to like marriage and like the roles that you were supposed to assume in a marriage, right? So very similarly, we have often unconsciously, sometimes explicitly, ideas about moral inferiority and superiority built in with race as well. So some beliefs about right and wrong, good and bad, either explicitly or implicitly. Y'all know that distinction, right? Explicit's overt, implicit implied, not expressly stated. Divide people into groups and contend that the interests of some count more than the other groups, or even that others do not count at all. So, for example, I'm going to tell you an extreme example that should be relatively uncontroversial. Think about Nuremberg laws in Germany. Right? They did not have a race-blind policy. You know what Nuremberg, it's like the ones that excluded Jews from legal protections in Germany as a way of putting them outside the protection of the law so that they didn't have rights. You create a whole class of second-class citizens that way, right? So, what, if anything, however, could justify the difference in treatment? Usually we say that equals ought to be treated equally, right? And equal there typically doesn't mean means non-arbitrarily, right? So like the things that if you're a person, it doesn't matter what color a person are, you get treated equally. That kind of equality, right? Or people who have merited the same things get the same kinds of rewards. So if there's a difference between them that's relevant to and is there a difference between them that's relevant and justifies a difference in treatment? So, for example, I mentioned early Kant. Kant did not think that certain groups of what we would all think of as Homo sapiens were not all rational beings. So, for example, I mentioned the example of women for Kant, and also early Kant, at least, with regard to Africans. And Mill did the same thing. The civilized versus uncivilized people, in that passage that I put up on the harm principle, it explicitly referenced civilized groups. Well, Mill was a British dude, and guess who didn't count as civilized, right? So is there some factual difference, biological, physiological, between individuals or groups of people that justifies difference in treatment? Or is there some behavioral difference between individuals or groups of people that justifies a difference? So, for example, all things being equal, people get treated equally, meaning they all have a right to free movement, but then you go commit a crime of a certain sort and we lock your ass up because your behavior justified our difference in treatment, right? So basic principles of equal treatment, equal opportunity, usually what we think of as core elements in any conception of justice, right? Require that differences in treatment must be justified by showing there's some relevant reason that justifies that difference in treatment. Modern moral theories, despite how some of the folks that came up with them lived or actually thought what policies they thought, they at least purport to have these lofty moral notions in them, like moral equality. So all rational agents are of equal moral worth. Same with sentient beings and utilitarianism. For Aristotle, it would have been rationality again. That's the criteria there. And because we all have equal moral worth, that means that we should all be able to get equal opportunities in society and receive equal treatment from society. So that I'm walking around selling loose cigarettes, I don't get a knee put on my neck. Right? So equal treatment, equal rewards for equal accomplishments, equal punishments for equal wrongs. Right? We've also seen that the problem of arbitrariness does pop up here with those various theories. Your textbook did a good job, usually at the end of each chapter, showing how there is a problem with this lofty theory that we've been looking at, whether it's Kantianism, Aristotle with natural slaves and women, Mill and the barbarians, Kant again on race and women as well. So one thing, if you want to look for an empirical difference, you'd have to define what race is. Here's, this is a fun one. It's about the metaphysics of race. This is, again, not John Stuart Mill, but Charles Mills. Comes up with the case of Mr. Oreo. Y'all know who Rachel... I'm going to look it up. I forget the last name. It was like in the news several years ago. She worked for the NAACP, and she presented herself as an African-American woman, but she was not an African-American woman. What we're going to talk about is what counts as an African-American here. But she presented herself as if she was a black woman, when in fact she, in none of the ways that we usually think about what would define a black or a white person, she didn't have any of those, right? So there's even a documentary about her now, Rachel. It's on Netflix. That's it right here. Somebody said it, I think, over there. The Racial Divide. There's the documentary. It's on Netflix there. So let's look at the story real quick. She presented herself as a black woman despite being born to 2 white parents. Right, there's a picture of her. So she was trying to pass, right, as an African American, working for the NCAA on behalf of black people. There was a professor recently, I think this was like this year, that I think presented themselves as if they were Native American, and they weren't Native American here not too long ago. So there are these instances of this stuff that pop up that like kind of raise the question about, okay, well, how are we going to define race? Which seems like a really easy thing to define. As it turns out, any biologist students in here, it's really hard to define race biologically. So that's what. So that's part of what Mr. Oreo is about in Mills's case here. So we got Mr. Oreo. I like to think of it as analogous to like a machine that turned what's Captain America's real name? Like Steve Austin? What is it?
Steve Rogers.
Steve Rogers, right? 90-pound weakling into the first Avenger with all the serums. It's like that, only for race, right? But it does have one of them is about strength, right? So strength, we all know, is that's a physical property of a person, right? So Mills's case of Mr. Oreo. Consider the case of someone I'll call Mr. Oreo. He cannot even think of passing, being quite dark and clearly black African features with a known black ancestry. So unlike, what's her last name, Donzello, or whatever her name is, Rachel. But he is unhappy with his racial designation, so he fills out white on bureaucratic forms, like his driver's license, right? Identifies himself as white and rejects black culture. Will those gestures make him white? And of course, all of us are like, that's a dumb question. And obviously, that's not going to make him white, right? Just writing down, checking a box ain't going to do it, right, on a government form. But the idea is that would involve like social recognition of some kind, right? The form being a government form and all. So suppose individuals such as Mr. Oreo, whose bodies are not naturally white, make use of this device. It's a plastic surgery, genetic engineering that transforms one's appearance so that they look white. Another way of thinking, hopefully you did the reading, so there's like 4 different views of race. One of them is a genetic, like the biological essentialist view, right? So we'd be looking for like a black gene or something like that, right? And then go on to assimilate as above. So they transform themselves, they can pass as white, and then they start checking off these government forms. In these cases, does their artificiality rather than their naturally white body appearance support doubts of those who question whether one can really change one's race? So normally we think of race as not something that you could change, but what? As a permanent part of you that you have no control over, right? Why? What would the basis of the skepticism be? Compare another kind of physical transformation, that of bodily physique and strength. So here we have the Steve Rogers. If a machine were invented, call this the Schwarzenegger machine, that could transform a 98-pound weakling into massively muscled Superman, capable of pressing hundreds of pounds without the tedium of tiers of special diets and weight training? Would we say that the person only looked strong but had not really become strong? Well, in that case, we would say, well, of course they're strong, right? So you see the disanalogy, right? It's about physical stuff, but this person, we want to say no in the first case, but yes in the second case, but it's still a physical characteristic. So there looks like a contradiction in there somewhere, right? Or there's some kind of instability in our notions of what constitutes race even, right? So would we say that the person only looked strong but had not really become strong? Obviously not. His new body, new physique, and new strength are real. So what's the difference between the first case and the second case, right? That's starting to raise a question about how are we really going to define race. So consider the someone, I'll call Mr. Oreo again. Yes, he's white now. Mr. Oreo's white now. No, he's not white, or I don't know, right? But what could justify that difference? So how do we define race? Well, there's a couple of different criteria that people might try and use here, all of which have really strange counterintuitive implications. I remember this was several years ago, and Halle Berry, who's obviously a famous actress, she said that she subscribed to the one drop theory. So if you had one drop of black blood, what she called black blood in you, then you were black. Even if you look like a white person, you would still be white. So she had the one drop theory, right? So one is physical appearance, right? So there's both the strength and the outward appearance of race issue. Ancestry, right? Who were your parents? Were they white or black? Self-awareness of ancestry. Others' awareness of ancestry. Is culture what defines race? Is it having a certain kind of social or political experience? Or is it simply a matter of getting to choose your own self-identity however you want to define that? You see the same sorts of debates revolving around like transgender stuff, right? We would say, if I walked around and said that I'm a 6'5", 15-year-old, because that's how I feel on the inside, y'all ain't buying that part, right? Not going to buy that part. In the same way, if I walked in and said, well, I discovered, this happens, right? And you know those ancestry tests that you can take? The commercial for one is like this guy finds out that he's not German and is Scottish, and so in the commercial they have him like in a Scottish outfit. Like all of a sudden he's just Scottish because he's got the outfit on. So now he's just adopting the cultural definition of it because he's learned something about his own ancestry, right? So something's really weird going on with just our ordinary ways of thinking about race there. There's something inconsistent with it. So the metaphysics of race. When you poll people on that, most will likely say that race is a permanent feature of an individual. Most people are likely to say that the weakling really is strong after the transformation. But most people are likely to say that Mr. Oreo is not really white after his transformation. But then what's the principled reason for claiming that Mr. Oreo isn't white now, but the weakling really is strong now? If we say that Mr. Oreo is not really white after the transformation procedure, but that the weakling really is strong after his, there seems to be, again, some kind of inconsistency in our notions of race. And we all kind of know these things, that there's something going on here because we do it with gender as well. We don't always think about gender as XY chromosomes. We talk about people throwing like a girl, right? There's a famous feminist essay on throwing like a girl and how women's own body movements are a result of socialization, right? So it's by mentioned in the last chapter. It's an older essay by Iris Marion Young. In the last chapter, they talked about under the political model of responsibility. And we talk this way about can Eminem really be a rapper? Isn't that a black cultural art form, right? All these sorts of things, or people acting like they're not a member of their race, right? So that's like a cultural practice thing. So many of the ways in which we actually, in everyday language, talk about race seem to be either cultural or behavioral rather than like physiological traits, right? So some kind of disconnect going on in there. So then we got a problem defining race. We also going to have a problem defining racism. I put these up on Moodle for you as well. There's the excerpt from the stuff from Mills that I'll talk about, and there's also excerpt from Bloom here about race and racism. And so most of us, when we think about racism, probably the paradigmatic example that comes up is like a self-consciously hating person, right? Like a Nazi, right? Who like has outward expressions of hatred, right? He's going to expand that notion of racism a little bit here. So he says, not all racial incidents are racist incidents. Not every instance of racial conflict, insensitivity, or discomfort, miscommunication, exclusion, injustice, or ignorance should be called racist. This more varied and nuanced moral vocabulary needs to be more fully utilized, complementing racist and racism. All forms of racial ills should elicit concern from responsible citizens. If someone displays racial insensitivity but not racism, so he's already got one kind of distinction in there, people should be able to see that straightforwardly as a matter of moral concern. Right? No, double standard. It's again like the arbitrariness thing of like judging one person one way just simply based on race. So he says, in this light, I want to suggest that what all forms of racism can be related to either of two general themes. Here are two kind of key ideas. Make sure you get these down. Inferiorization and antipathy. Inferiorizing is treating the racial other as inferior or of lesser moral value, and secondarily viewing the racial other as inferior. Right? Racial antipathy is simply a strong dislike, often tinged with hostility towards individuals or groups because of their race. Of the two modes, inferiorization is more obviously linked to historical racist doctrines and social systems, slavery, segregation, imperialism, apartheid, Nazism, all involved certain groups being regarded and treated as inferior. That's why they're going to be second-class citizens, or not citizens at all, because we're trying to justify in some way their inferiority. The Nazi doctors thought that it was, it wasn't just Nazi doctors, there were American doctors in the Civil War area, that, thought that there were physical differences that showed that there was this kind of inferiority. Right? It's weird to link biology and morality in a particular way right there. Right? So, but race-based hatred is also central to the ideological and attitudinal components of Nazism, and for whatever reason, racial bigotry, hostility, and hatred are now securely linked to the contemporary idea of racism, both in Europe and the United States. Indeed, the racial bigot is many people's paradigm of an image of a racist, and few would now deny application of the appellation racist to such persons. But again, he wants to say that any form that involves inferiorization or antipathy would still count as that, even if you didn't have so you could have antipathy, but not have overt hatred for the other race, right? So that's a little bit expanding the notion of just the paradigmatic example of a racist is self-consciously hating them, just someone who has antipathy for another race, but maybe doesn't hate them. They're just maybe radical indifference to them, right? So then the racial contract. This is Mills. This is the earlier thing for Mills. And they've mentioned it throughout the textbook a few times. They started mentioning it all the way back in the social contract theory section for the obvious reason that what Mills is worried about is kind of social contract theory and how groups of people have been included or excluded from the protection of that contract. In Louisiana's own history, aside from issues of race, in South Louisiana, there are groups of Indians who were treated quite poorly as a matter of actual legal measures as well. So de jure, rather than just de facto, forms of discrimination, for example. All right, so we're going to start with the original position. This is, again, Rawls. And think about this as like the model of how we're going to start off our ideal society, right? So thus we're to imagine that those who engage in social cooperation together in one joint act, the principles which are to assign basic rights and duties to determine the social division of social benefits. This original position is understood as a purely hypothetical situation. There's the ideal, right? Characterized so as to lead to a certain conception of justice. Among the essential features of this situation is that no one knows his place in society, his class position, his social status, nor does he know his fortunate distribution of natural assets or abilities, intelligence, strength, and the like. So the upshot for there is, behind the veil of ignorance, you do not know your race. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. This ensures that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged in the choice of principles by the outcome of natural chance or the contingency of social circumstances. Since all were similarly situated and no one is able to define principles to favor his particular condition, the principles of justice are a result of a fair agreement or bargain. If that's how we founded like the U.S., that'd be okay. Was that how we did it? We weren't behind a veil of ignorance, exactly. Where are we? Right. So again, we have these ideals, but then, so we got the ideal contract, right? And then we have like our actual historical circumstances, right? Behind that veil of ignorance, I have an extra slide in there. You don't have to worry about that second one. It's repeating something from the first one. We get justice is fairness. So this is Rawls's Kantian notion of a just society. So first we get the liberty principle. Each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of basic liberties compatible with the similar scheme of liberties for others. So usually the idea of the modern conception of a right is not rooted in your class status like a king or a serf or a peasant. It's rooted in the idea that if I have certain rights to pick which religion that I'm going to practice, that you have a right to pick which religion, if any, that you're going to practice. I'm not going to make y'all all go to the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster with me. You get to decide what you want to do. Or sleep in bed. So it's a liberty principle. And by the way, Rawls's theory of justice would be left of center to most everybody in the U.S. Right. It would require quite a bit of, it would require some significant redistribution. So no one really disputes the first principle in Rawls's theory. It's all, most of the debate is over 2, and it's really 2A here, where people have written their dissertations on that dispute right here. So the difference principle, social and economic inequalities. Notice he doesn't say that we have to get rid of all of them for a just society. There's going to be some. But social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that A, they are to be the greatest benefit to the least advantaged members of society. So that's going to require some redistribution. Right? We're in an institution right now that redistributes money in a couple of different ways, takes money from our taxes to be able to fund public education, both either directly to the university in its budget or through things like TOPS or making money available for low interest loans, student loans, and this sort of thing, right? Or grants that you don't have to pay back, right? And then B, offices and positions must be open to everyone under the conditions of fair, equal opportunity. So again, when it comes to Rawls's debates over Rawls, it's usually over A, right there. So if there's going to be economic inequalities, like if we're going to tax the shit out of billionaires, we got to take that money and give it to the least well off, right? That's what he's implying. So there's certainly a redistributive principle in there. All right, then we get to Mills. So that's right, he just passed away 2 years ago. The racial contract's from 97. Right? Y'all probably heard about critical race theory in the news. There are lots of different kinds of people that might get lumped together underneath that banner, but Mills is the person who says, I would be considered one of those people. Right? You probably heard that critical race theorists are trying to teach people to like hate white people. Let's see if we find anything in Mills like that. He's got 10 theses that are in that book. I got an excerpt of that book for you up on Moodle as well, but we're going to go through a couple kind of key passages here as well. So we got 10 theses. We got the racial contract as political, moral, and epistemological. So that last word, we haven't talked much about epistemology in a while, has to do with knowledge. We talked about that earlier in the semester with regard to moral knowledge and moral skepticism. But he's saying that kind of analogously to what we saw Beyer say, where she said that women, because of their experience, are better suited to recognize some problems about their own interest than maybe men in government are, right? He's making the same claim about people who have been subject to racism, right? 2, the racial contract is a historical actuality. 3, it's an exploitation contract. What he means by exploitation, you should think of in like terms of labor and production of value, right? So, people get work, but they're not fairly compensated for it. Right? The racial contract norms and race as space, demarcating civil and wild spaces. John Stuart Mill. The harm principle applies to all civilized nations, or all civilized societies, right? It's because they're wild that we can be awfully paternalistic to them to bring them up to speed with us, right? Us being the Europeans there. So the racial contract norms the individual and races the individual. On my driver's license, I have to decide what race I'm going to put down. But if you're of a mixed background, maybe that's more of a question for you than it would be for me. Right? And then here's kind of where we get back to this distinction, like the ideal versus the non-ideal theory. The racial contract underwrites the modern social contract. And what he means by that is basically a European and American society. Western developed society. Then the racial contract has to be enforced through violence and ideological conditioning. That's 7. 8, the racial contract historically tracks the actual moral and political consciousness of most white agents. Then the racial contract has always been recognized by non-whites as the real moral and political agreement to be challenged. So it's like we have our everyday language about justice and the contract and equal citizens, but really underwriting that is this domination contract. Right? So there's a line that gets used here somewhere. Justice means just us. So it's, and the us there is like people who look like me. And then 10, and here's his philosophical and theoretical point. Another key theoretical point is the racial contract theory is explanatory superior to the raceless social contract, in other words, the ideal theory. Or what purports to be the race-neutral ideal theory. Right? So, racially blind. Stephen Colbert, from his old show when he was sarcastic, he used to say, I don't see race, right? You can find that one on it. So he begins with this distinction, a naturalized, which is basically a non-ideal account versus an ideal account. In tracking the actual moral consciousness of most white agents, remember that was one of our 10 planks there, in depicting the actual political realities non-whites have always recognized, The theory of the racial contract shows its superiority to the ostensibly abstract and general, but actually white social contract. So in other words, something like Rawls's theory of the veil of ignorance, it purports to be like race neutral, but really it's like, I'm a white guy behind that veil, right? You can't really achieve that sort of thing, in other words. I've been given what, in the current jargon of philosophers, would be called a naturalized account rather than an idealized account. But if ethics and political philosophy are focused on norms, that we want to endorse, ideals, so to speak, like the categorical imperative, the principle of utility, the golden rule, what really is the point of this exercise? What would be the point of naturalizing ethics, which is explicitly the realm of the ideal? Remember, I started off with like what philosophers have always wanted to do is talk about the ideal society, right? We're going to be philosopher kings talking in the nocturnal council about how everything ought to be run as if it's not a part of society, as if we've left society behind when we're having these conversations in the college seminar room or something like that. Right? So in other words, the point is not to endorse this deficient consciousness and these repugnant ideals, but by recognizing their past and current influence and power and identifying their sources to correct for them. This is where he's headed in the later essay as a corrective theory of racial justice. And it's going to sound really Kantian. It's going to sound, he's drawing back on Rawls again. It's going to sound Kantian. Realizing a better future requires not merely admitting the ugly truth of the past and present, but understanding the ways in which these realities were made invisible and acceptable to the white population. We want to know both to describe and to explain the circumstances that actually blocked the achievement of ideal, raceless ideals and promoted instead the naturalized, non-ideal, racial ideals. Racism and racially structured discrimination have not been deviations from the norm, but they have been the norm, not merely in the sense of de facto, again, unofficial statistical distribution of patterns, but as I emphasized at the start, in the sense of being formally codified, written down, and proclaimed as such. There's a book called, it's a pretty influential book. I'm not a historian, but it's a book by a historian called Hitler's American Plan. And it was about, you know it?
I've heard of it.
You've heard of it? It got quite a bit of press when it came out. And it makes sense, and I don't doubt it really in the broad strokes. I don't doubt the book really, but it was basically like Hitler got ideas for Nuremberg laws from racial segregation laws in the U.S. So formally codified, in other words. For a long time in U.S. history, we had, it's separate but equal, right? That kind of stuff. Or we had, black people don't get to vote, or a poll test, right, to see who could vote. I have a friend that teaches Southern politics, and sometimes he gives the Louisiana poll test to his class, and they fail it. And it was from like the 1700s or something like that, or the 1800s or something like this, or early 1900s, 19th century or 20th century, and everybody in the class is failing this poll test to be able to vote. So from this perspective, the racial contract has underwritten the social contract so that duties, rights, and liberties have routinely been assigned on a racially differentiated basis. Whites then will act in racist ways while thinking themselves as acting morally. In other words, they will experience genuine cognitive, that which is to say epistemic, that first line, that first number one point in the 10 planks, difficulties in recognizing certain behavior patterns as racist. So that quite apart from the questions of motivation and bad faith, they will be morally handicapped simply from a conceptual point of view of seeing and doing the right thing. Evasion and deception thus become the epistemic norm, right? Like touching people's hair without permission or something like this. Right? So with the racial contract, as we have seen, and he's correct about all of these thinkers did this. With the racial contract, as we have seen, there's a similar pattern among contractarians. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, and their theoretical adversaries. The anti-contractarian Hume, who denies that any race other than the white one has produced a civilization. It's in a footnote in Inquiry to Human Understanding where he says that. And Mill, who I've already pointed out, who denies the applicability of his anti-paternalist harm principle to barbarians and maintains that they need European colonial despotism, and the historicist Hegel, a 19th century philosopher, who denies that Africa has any history and suggests that blacks were morally improved through being enslaved. If you ever, and I'm not recommending you do this, but if you spend any time around the, like 4chan, or 8kun, or the darker elements of the internet, where the, like Stormfront, where like the racists congregate online, you can see people giving just like really bad versions, even worse, like by bad versions, I mean like not even as articulate as Hegel's version of that argument that slavery was good for black people. So that the racial contract is orthogonal to the varying direction of their thought, the common assumption that they all take for granted, no matter what their theoretical divergences on the other. In other words, it's like they're writing these books and they're acting like they're writing it for everybody, but it's really just a book for like Europeans, white Europeans, right, with these theories in them. So finally, the theory of the racial contract, by separating whiteness as a phenotype or racial classification. That's how you look. Your phenotype, right? Your outward appearance. From whiteness with a capital W there as a political and economic system committed to the white supremacy opens a theoretical space for the repudiation of that contract. One could then distinguish being white from being white. In other words, white having to do with your personal appearance versus white in terms of a socio-political economic position. So the way I say it is usually using like slang. You can be white without being whitey, right? Being whitey with a capital W, being the white man, right, in the abstract. So, but for the racial contract, it is different. The real choice for whites, though admittedly difficult one, is the rejection of the racial contract and the normed inequalities of the white polity. That does not require you to leave one's country, but to speak out and struggle against the terms of the social contract, the racial contract. So in the case of moral and political judgments about one's consent to the legitimacy of the political system and the conclusions about one's effectively having become a signatory of that contract are apropos. And so are judgments of one's culpability. By unquestioningly going along with things, by accepting all the privileges of whiteness, with that socioeconomic part, with the contaminant complicity in the system of white supremacy, one can say to have consented to whiteness. So, and this is, you'll see him do something slightly different in the corrective justice lecture, but here's in this early piece in the late 90s, this is what he was saying that it would involve, right? So what's required for a subperson, a second-class citizen, to assert him or herself morally? Again, it's going to sound very Kantian here, even though he's just been quite critical of Kant, right? Or at least Kant in practice, anyway. So first, there's the moral dimension, claiming that the moral status and personhood for oneself by demanding recognition of that status for others. Right? It's demanding self-respect and demanding respect from others. Then the epistemic depiction take control of how they are depicted in history. So sometimes you hear people use this slogan, representation matters, right? That's more contemporary colloquial language, but it's basically the same idea, taking control of how your images are used in media. And then the bodily or aesthetic dimension. So again, there's where the self-respect comes in. So Black is Beautiful. There's this, another documentary. Y'all know who Chris Rock is, surely. Chris Rock has it used to be on Netflix, and it was about hair and black women's hair and what constituted good hair for a long time was basically straightened and chemically altered hair that made it look smooth and not coarse like a white woman. So like there's the beauty thing, right? Adopting white standards of beauty, right? Rather than your own natural hair. So then the basic argument is that racial contract does a better job both of explaining how history and our current socioeconomic realities came to be and prescribing what we ought to do to overcome them. What you need to look for then, well, I'll come back to it. So the domination contract, this is towards the end of it. This is what he really calls it. So the simple central innovation is to posit a group domination contract that is exclusionary rather than genuinely exclusive, and then rethink everything from that perspective. But the basic idea is to utilize what Hampton, who was our critic of Hobbesian social contract theory early way on in the semester, is Jean Hampton. She's a feminist contract theory. He's mentioning her here. Sees as central to contractarianism the shaping role of human causality. And then to show that how this is both retained and necessarily transformed in a polity where human causality is group-centered rather than dispersed among equal powerful individuals. And so I go back to Rawls here, but then here in the thing that y'all will watch Tuesday, remember we don't meet for class Tuesday, so this is like the end game of that last part, but I'm going to give it to you in advance because I want you to pay attention to how he gets there in that last part of the lecture. So, three main principles of corrective justice, which he tries to get from Kantian, right? So, pretty clearly, he's not saying hate all black people if he's going to draw on white people. He's going to draw on Rawls. Right? So, first, end unequal citizenship, end exploitation, and then end racial disrespect. So Mills's theory is a non-ideal theory, but it's not about distributive justice, but about corrective justice. How do we go from these non-ideal racial non-ideals to a more perfect, like using Obama language, more perfect union, right? That kind of thing. So pay attention to how he gets each of those, even though none of those three are in Rawls. Listen to his talk about how he gets them from Rawls' theory of justice.